yesterday, the Gujarat government came out with a policy for electric vehicles. Now, one has to say that during the pandemic, we saw a global push for electric vehicles, but did India miss the EV bus or car or two-wheeler? The point we're trying to make is that, is India EV ready? We've had the country's largest automaker, Maruti's chairman, R.C. Bhargava, on ET Now several times saying India is nowhere close to being EV ready. So joining us today to talk about this, as states do all kind of top-ups on the famous FAME policy which subsidizes electric vehicles, two people with skin in the game. One is an EV maker, Ather Energy, and the founder Tarun joining us. And the second is one who likes to invest in EVs and has done so in the mobility space, Kunal Khattar of AdvantEdge. Thank you guys for joining us here on this edition of Startup Central. Tarun, I'm going to come to you first. You know, you've got a factory, you're doing these made in India electric vehicles. I understand, you know, you started launching in more and more cities with Delhi being added to that list. Can I ask you why you need the center and the states to incentivize EVs? And is that the right way to go?
Right. Mehta, that was probably a better question a few weeks back before these policies were announced. I think subsidies play a crucial role in the early years before volume builds up, right? The EV industry is just trying to build volume. You're starting to see a lot of good growth. Given the size of the Indian market, I think the next 2 to 3 years are going to be very crucial. We're going to see not 30-40% annual growth. We're going to see 30-40% month-on-month growth for the next couple of years, maybe even longer. Once there is a sizable volume built, that's when economics of scale kicks in. That's when, you know, supply chain costs optimize themselves. And, you know, that's when an industry's reliance on subsidy starts weaning out. It's a story that's played out in China, that's played out in US, and will play out in India also. So with this in mind, the general ask from a lot of us in the industry historically has been to the government that instead of thinking of a 10-year subsidy program, think of maybe like a 3 to 4 year subsidy program. Upfront, spend all the incentives that you have. Once the industry hits like 1 million or 2 million units annually, you don't likely need all these programs. But that's the stage when viability is under serious question. And that's also the stage when a lot of the early adopters are starting to come in. So you want to push them in, you want to remove more and more doubts out of their head, and economical incentives really play a great role. So I think subsidies play a role in a short-term window and at the earliest state possible. You don't need like a long-drawn subsidy program.
Kunal, if I can come to you now, you know, if an investor is going to be putting money into India's EV story, how important will all of these subsidies be? And the reason we're doing this conversation, of course, is because the state of Gujarat has come out with policy measures which will perhaps ensure the cheapest EVs on the roads of Gujarat.
Right. Hi, Nayantara. Thanks again for having me. No, absolutely. See, as much as I'd love to be dependent on subsidies to build businesses, I think to Tarun's point, you can't really sustain a business model there. I sometimes feel subsidies are like short-term fixes, but too much of subsidies are also harmful, just like too much of sugar is bad for you. I have a problem with the fact that we are heavily dependent on subsidies to make products viable. I personally feel that today the issue is more than trying to bring the price difference between a traditional vehicle and an ICE, a traditional ICE vehicle and EV. I feel that we probably need to focus on one is solving for the residual value challenges, which is preventing finance companies from rolling out financing products for EVs. Right now, the rate of interest they're charging is very high. Secondly, I think there's a consumer behavior change in play. As you know, technology evolves much faster than consumer behavior. Traditionally, if you were to buy a petrol vehicle, you don't ask a customer to pay for 5 years of petrol upfront, right? He pays for petrol on a usage-based model. So I think the disintermediation, which is the separation of the vehicle and the battery, is probably going to go a longer way for aid adoption. And ask customers to actually pay on a usage base or a lease-based model for a battery. And there, the price difference between a traditional vehicle and an EV will become much more narrower. and will probably aid in adoption much faster. So I think we need to be creative in different ways, whether it's financing, whether it's leasing, whether it's usage-based models. The beauty of EV products such as Ather and others is these are all IoTs, which means for the first time, whether you're manufacturers or you're a service provider, you have the ability to actually collect enough data to look at driving patterns and usage patterns and create financial solutions which are based on usage rather than more dependent on subsidies to reduce the capex or the price of the vehicle.
Okay, fair point. And as an EV maker, Tarun, you already have a factory. You've got others like let's look at Ola. It's no secret. Founder Bhavesh Agarwal, media reticent, did interviews right from the 500-acre factory in Tamil Nadu, saying you can't sell only 2,000 EVs and have a business model. There will be a capacity of 10 million by 2022. So, as an EV maker, do these subsidies make a difference to you where you're going to be selling, the dealerships, the franchise model, all of that?
Yeah, definitely. I think what the latest subsidies have recently done is they have expanded the addressable market for almost everybody considerably. For example, if you were building products that competed in the 125cc segment, suddenly your price points are competitive in the 110cc segment, a segment that's 4 times larger, right? So I think overnight, everybody's addressable segments have expanded dramatically. This means if 50 cities made sense to our business model until 2 weeks back, suddenly 200 cities make sense now. If we were looking at us, like whatever capacity plans we're looking at, I think have to be double, triple, even maybe more over the next year. So rapid expansion, that's what it means for us. This definitely drives this. Let me put it this way: it pulls volumes forward. A lot of customers, and Kunal is right, the total cost of ownership for an electric vehicle already was looking fantastic, right? But customers were going to take longer, right? Because they can't do the maths. They will still be a little cagey. Oh, it's okay. Like I know the total cost of ownership makes sense over 2.5 years, but I don't know how the EV market is over 2.5 years. I don't know much about the battery. I don't know much about charging, right? What this does is it pulls that math forward, and somebody was going to wait 2-3 years to consider going electric and consider going electric now. It just pulls the timeline on electrification forward dramatically. That's what it means, and that means significant volume expansion than what any of us anticipated.
Okay. Kunal, you were making some of these points earlier that, if India has to be EV ready and even be anywhere close to the 30% EV goal by 2030, a lot of other things need to be solved. Let's talk about some of them. While we do the subsidies, what makes the EV very expensive is also the battery and the lack of the trust that someone has that will I have enough charging station. Nobody wants to get stuck, right, on a highway or things like that. So as when it comes to infrastructure, shouldn't we look at subsidizing that more? I understand one point you have to subsidize the consumer, but on the other hand, do we need more subsidies maybe for the back-end infrastructure and the batteries?
So there within FAME 2 as well as state-sponsored subsidies, there are a large element or component of that which is reserved for building infrastructure, whether it's charging stations or whether it's new investments in new technologies for batteries as well. But I agree with you. I said that if I had to prioritize, I think if we're looking at a 10 to 15-year horizon, it's absolutely imperative that we not only subsidize the end user and make it more viable, but there is definitely should be more focus in creating that infrastructure, because range anxiety is probably, apart from cost of ownership, I think range anxiety and availability of fast charging networks is probably going to also go a long way to aid in adoption of EVs. So I think if we're able to create that, subsidy there is probably more desirable, if you ask me. I think from a cost of ownership standpoint, I think being creative in the way we finance these assets, separate the ownership of the vehicle and the battery, and sell the battery more on the usage or a lease-based model than a capex model. So that is less subsidy, but more financial engineering, and more importantly, giving comfort to banks and giving them an assurance of some sort of a buyback or a minimum residual value, which will give the confidence of banks to actually to finance these vehicles at lower interest costs. So I think we have to balance out the cash. Ultimately, you have limited capital available, and you've got to distribute that both between infrastructure, manufacturing, as well as the end retail customers.
Tarun, you want to come in on that? Do you think that's the way to go? But then, let's be realistic as well. We're talking about, the end of second wave, government needing to increase its expenditure, pump prime the economy. That's true for states as well. Not sure it'll have the elbow room to give those subsidies for the batteries and back end.
I think I think as far as demand incentives go, I think we've got a fantastic package already. I'm not sure that there are other ways of driving more financing for batteries and vehicles rather than necessarily fiscal incentives. Priority sector lending status, government essentially underwriting some of the potential risk here. They may not necessarily come with an immediate cash impact for the government, right? And they may never actually come with a cash impact if the sector does bear its promise. So I don't think it necessarily eats from the same cash bucket that the government has. And as far as infrastructure subsidies go, honestly, that's a small drop in the bucket compared to demand incentives. Like even if you wanted to have like 1,000 chargers per city, it's probably going to amount to like a few percentage points of the overall demand incentive subsidy that you're going to be allocating as far as light electric vehicles, electric scooters and electric motorbikes go. Your infrastructure subsidies certainly become very expensive if you're trying to do them for like large cars, electric cars or trucks or buses. That's where the infrastructure is super expensive. Electric scooters and electric motorbikes have a fairly low cost infrastructure. So I would imagine that I think using the kitty to sort of fund infrastructure, I don't think is going to dramatically change the plan. And I think creating more financing programs or creating more financing support, incentivizing banks to come and give loans for electric vehicles or batteries as a separate product, I don't think means immediate cash out for the government.
But Tarun, tell me one more thing, and this is, of course, the segment you're going after, the two-wheeler segment. It is looking like that the two-wheelers and maybe, the commercial buses will lead India's EV journey. They seem to be right in front, right? We look at Amazon and Flipkart. Between the two of them, they're planning to electrify their fleet by 35,000 two-wheelers, EVs, in a couple of years. As that happens, the price points, are they affordable, especially when you talk about the two-wheeler segment, or is this going to stay for some time for the corporates that want to go green or the rich, the 1%?
I think with the new subsidies that we have, equivalent products in the same category, equivalent electric vehicles in the same category are going to be now almost the same price as their petrol vehicles. And I'm talking about upfront price itself, right? So something competing in the 150cc category is going to look very similar. Something competing in the 110cc category is going to be now roughly in the same price point as a typical 110cc scooter. So I think the new subsidies definitely solve for that in the short term. It gives the industry a few years, about 2.5 to 3 years, to improve cost structures so that as the subsidies start weeding away, we can maintain the price competitiveness. But honestly, to your fundamental question, Andhra, I think that the overall unit economics, the overall economics for the end consumer makes a phenomenal amount of sense with these subsidies now. And once you layer government or state level subsidies on top of it, in many cases, electric vehicles with the same performance are going to be maybe even cheaper than their petrol counterparts. Once everybody's done doing this path of what's the final on-road price with all these subsidies landed up. I no longer fear that a lot of consumers are going to be still constrained with price after all of this. You're also going to see an expansion of product portfolios. I think you're also going to see more and more products from all of us now over the next 12 months, which are able to take more and more advantage of these new programs and launch products more competitively. But essentially, we're going to see upfront price parity between electric and petrol in the next in the next 1 year. And then as volume builds up, we'll be able to maintain those price points despite subsidies getting phased out over the next few years.
Kunal, you come in there now. You know, we are talking at a time when you see bazooka after bazooka from the Fed, right? And every other day a startup is raising millions and millions of dollars. When I look at EVs, would you concede the kind of inflows that are coming in for EVs? India is behind on that front. You know, it's also during the pandemic, you saw Elon Musk and Tesla and, you know, all that had to take place. Why is that the case? Is that also because what I just asked Tarun is being seen as whether it is the delivery fleet and, you know, the buses, it's still not a mass product as yet simply because of the affordability?
I think it's a couple of reasons, then, Tara. I think number one, of course, is that EVs require significant amount of capital upfront to invest. So even though there are a lot of opportunities to come in at the ground floor level, the entire ecosystem has to be developed. So similar to a chicken and egg story, right? Ather is in manufacturing and selling of two-wheelers, but now for Ather to start selling large volumes, you need an installed base of charging systems. You also need suppliers making components and things like that. So when you're creating a new category of mobility as a whole, you're talking about a number of different players in the ecosystem coming up at the same time. So it's a far more complex business model because interdependencies between players in the whole value chain is very, very strong, and they all have to come up in the same time. Some players within the ecosystem get capitalized or overcapitalized and run ahead of others, and then they have to wait for others to catch up. So I think at the end of the day, that is happening. Number two is on the manufacturing side, which is probably one of the biggest investment opportunities out there. It's typically not a venture capital or a tech investment kind of a play. They require large amounts of capital. Most of it is going towards setting up manufacturing capabilities, etc. So very little technical leverage that there is when you compare to, say, a software company or a social media company and things like that. Of course, COVID did not help. There are a few sectors that actually got hurt a lot in COVID. One, it's the automotive and the mobility sector. So the sentiments itself were not very great, especially when existing investments made by the leading VCs didn't really perform the way they would. So if you're a sector agnostic fund and you have the luxury of moving away from a specific sector and focusing on other sectors like edtech or fintech or social media, which have actually got tailwinds during COVID, we saw that focus move away from mobility. But every industry and vertical are cyclical in nature. So I think as a fund, and we're a sector-focused fund, we're actually doubling down. This is actually the best time for us to deploy capital, which we've been doing, and we've closed 6 deals in the last 10 months, and we continue to do that because we feel the interest in mobility and EV will probably start picking up in the next 6 to 12 months. And I think that will be ideally suited to start seeing larger mega rounds and more capital flow into this sector.
Okay, with that, gentlemen, I'd like to thank both of you for joining us on this edition of Startup Central. We really wanted to discuss that all that you're seeing states topping up, whether it's, road tax exemption, registration fee exemptions, other kind of incentives that you're seeing, with Gujarat being the best one now. What's going to be the impact on ground? I think in a couple of months, let's get you both back to see if this has proved to be what the intent was, to get more people to buy electric vehicles, to go more green as well. With that, ladies and gentlemen, we'll take a short commercial break. Stay tuned.